We appreciate you coming. Thanks to the folks watching on the webcast. We're here to talk about the cover story of the latest issue of the Washington Monthly, Who Broke America's Jobs Machine, that is authored by two of my colleagues here at New America, Lynn and Phil Longman. It is the question of the day. Unquestionably the greatest crisis facing the country right now is unemployment. Job growth was slow coming into the recession. It is now more or less zero and looks to be very weak for many years to come. And what we have produced in this current cover story is a way of thinking about unemployment and jobs that I think is not yet part of the debate, but predict will be. And by way of getting into what we're going to talk about today, I'd like to tell a quick story. About 6 years ago, a friend of mine called, a writer. He was helping media mogul Ted Turner write a magazine story that no other magazine would publish, and asked if I'd take a look at it. Of course, Ted Turner, I'm delighted to look at Ted Turner's story. And the theme of the story was, it's an autobiographical piece about how he created CNN, and his thesis was that if the rules of media consolidation today applied in the early 60s when he was starting out, there would not have been CNN. Nor does he think would there have been Fox or any of the other breakthrough broadcast companies of recent years. And his argument was that back in the 60s, the federal government, the FCC, made sure that individual entrepreneurs got a start and could thrive in the business. What Ted Turner did was bought a money-losing UHF station and then another one, and then was able to build those into the superstation and ultimately CNN, which changed the whole paradigm of broadcast news from telling you what happened before to showing you news that is breaking at the moment. And probably one of the great entrepreneurs of all time. But eventually the federal government got out of the business of encouraging entrepreneurs and writing the rules such that the independent local guy could have a foothold in the market, and wrote the rules such that only through consolidation could you survive. And Turner spent the rest of the story talking about how he built and grew CNN, trying to get it to scale where it could survive, eventually had to sell out to Time Warner. And his argument was we simply can't have a thriving media environment where a handful of companies control all the outlet and all the content, and made the point that there's not been a Ted Turner or even a Rupert Murdoch in the last 20 years who's come along and really challenged the big boys. So it was a fascinating piece. Turner eventually was on the Charlie Rose show talking about his story and was bragging about it and said, yeah, it ran in some magazine. I can't remember the name of it, but it was a good story. But it was the Washington Monthly. So some years after that, we continued to explore this vein of analysis in the area of broadband. And a number of stories by people like New America's Nick Thompson looked at why it is the United States has gone from 4th to 15th in broadband penetration and speed. And their argument was that we've allowed the incumbent deliverers of broadband, essentially the baby bells, to crush competition, and that competition which had been built into the market in '96 but was allowed to be crushed, and hence we're light years behind other countries, not only in the speed and penetration of our broadband, but all the jobs and new industries that provides. So we were interested in this general notion that consolidation of industry hurts jobs, economic dynamism, and economic growth. And it was in that context that Phil Longman and Barry Lynn proposed a story that took that concept and basically made a unified field theory of it, that it's not just in broadband or in the media space, broadcast, where we've seen consolidation of industries. It is throughout our economy, in everything from eyeglasses to pet food, that a handful of companies have more or less sewn up markets. And they then produced a piece that we're going to talk about today that walks us through how that has affected, we think, the jobs and the jobs picture in the United States. So I want to just get started by introducing our panelists today. Barry Lynn is the author of the new book, Cornered, The New Monopoly, Capitalism, and Economics of Destruction. He directs the Markets, Enterprise, and Resiliency Initiative here at New America Foundation, and I thoroughly recommend his book. It's fabulous. Phil Longman is a Bernard L. Schwartz Fellow at the Washington Monthly, a longtime contributor and a senior fellow here at New America, where he and Lynn are launching a new enterprise and innovation project. Phil his latest book is with Ray Bouchara, The Next Progressive Era, a blueprint for broad prosperity, which looks at the way the early progressives looked at entrepreneurship and created rules that made it possible for individual entrepreneurs to thrive and grow in ways that Ted Turner was the beneficiary of, and fewer are today. So I want to thank you for coming and turn it over first to Phil Longman.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you all for coming very much. I want to talk briefly about jobs to set up this context. You know, we never really could quite figure out what to call the last decade. You know, some people said call it the aughts, and that didn't quite seem right. But if there's any single number that applies to the last decade, it's probably zero. Because the last decade was really distinguished from any other decade that we know about, in that from beginning to end, it produced on net no new jobs. Every other decade, going back to the 40s, we had at least a 20% increase in jobs. But in the last decade, zero. Now, there's a lot of competing thoughts we have in our heads and theories about, you know, what happened, why did that apply. One, obviously, is the bubble theory, that we had this gigantic housing bubble, misdirected capital, and all. And, you know, no doubt there's a lot of truth in that, except it's strange that even at the height of this bubble, back in 2006, 2007, it barely produced any jobs. Whereas the previous bubble, the high-tech bubble of the late 90s, produced tons of jobs. So we've got to look at places beyond just bubble theory. Then there's the common thought that points to globalization and looks at all the jobs we lost to China, all the jobs we lost to India. But the funny thing about that is the actual rate of job destruction in the last decade was lower than in the 90s. We actually have very little job destruction in the 90s. What changed between the 90s and the last decade was that we had a dramatic fall-off in job creation. So you might remember in the 1990s, it was all the fad among corporate titans to downsize and re-engineer the corporation. A lot of people were losing their jobs in that period. Not so much in the aughts. Some people point to technology. They looked at all the jobs that were lost because of the spread of e-commerce and how many travel agents were put out of business, right? But the thing that's not quite right about that is that we've had technological change, you know, throughout the history of mankind and in accelerating paces in the 20th century. And yeah, a lot of farmers lost their way of life, but on balance, this new technology created more new jobs and even better paying jobs. So it's kind of weird about what would it be about the internet that makes it fundamentally different than, say, assembly lines. Now, another theory you could say is like, well, where does most new jobs come from? They come from small business, right? That's where most innovation comes from, is small business. Can we blame regulation for putting the thumb on small business? Well, you know, I think not. We came through a long era of the Bush administration when regulation was laxer than it was previously. So this raises the question of whether we can Also, think about another possibility, another mega trend, every bit as big as globalism, but about which we hardly say a word, and that is concentration of industry. Now, anybody who's been awake in the last 2 years has seen some of this. It's become recognizable. As Paul talked about, we all have this new phrase in our vocabulary, too big to fail. We now know that there is such a thing as too much consolidation in the banking industry. Through this healthcare debate that we're still in the midst of, a lot of us have learned just how concentrated health insurance business is in some places, where somewhere like Alabama you might have only 2 carriers in the whole state. Some of us have watched documentaries like Food Inc. or read writers like Michael Pollan, and we're starting to be aware of how much consolidation there is in agriculture and in food processing, and of the dangers that come from that consolidation. But by and large, I think it's still fair to say that most of us are walking around with a received view that the United States has the most open markets in the world, that consumers are well served by what consolidation we have out there, and that this is the American way, and anybody who questions it is suspect. So what I want to invite you to do, and what Barry's going to help me to do in a second here, is to give you a flavor of things that you can't read in the newspaper, you're unlikely to know about unless you are in small business or part of those businesses, but that are true, and that I think on balance are very important, a huge threat to our political freedom, but also to the great jobs machine that is now broken. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Barry. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Phil, and thank you, Paul, and thank you all for coming out today. When I started to write this book a couple years ago, this is sort of follow up what Phil was just saying. When I started to write Cornered, people would say, "What are you working on?" I said, "I'm working on a book about monopolies in America," and people would say, "You're out of your mind. This is the greatest cowboy capitalistic system in the entire world." And as Phil just mentioned, people are starting to doubt that now. But just to give you the sense about why, we ended up in this article, we ended up doing a whole long section just kind of detailing some of the concentration that has taken place in our society, just because it's still so contrary to what we've been taught, what we have been told this last generation. And one of the sort of confirmation for doing so, actually it just came yesterday. Tom Frank in the Wall Street Journal wrote an article about Cornered, and here's a guy. He's a sort of a plains populist of sort. He really pays attention to these issues. Tom Frank, as most of you may know, wrote the book, What's the Matter with Kansas? And he said, Cornered has about it the feel of a secret history. It presents us with an amazing catalog of present-day monopolies, oligopolies, and economic combinations. Its subjects are, by definition, some of the largest and most powerful organizations in the world, and yet none of this was familiar to me. That was Tom Frank. So anyway, I assume that most of us are kind of in the same place as Tom Frank is, so I'll just give you a few examples of what's happened in our economy this last generation. If any of you actually happen to be at the book event that we did about a month ago, these might sound a little bit familiar, but, well, they're good stories. I'm going to tell them again. The glasses. You guys go to buy glasses. Eyewear. You might go out to a chain that's called Pearl Vision. Or maybe you'll go across the hall in the mall and go to a place called Lens Crafters. Or maybe you say, well, I'm going to go to a more budget operation, so I'm going to go to Target Optical, or maybe I'll go to Sears Optical. Well, the fact is, if you go to any of those places, or you go to Sunglass Hut, you're actually all going, it's the same company. It's an Italian company called Luxottica. They bought up all of those chains over the last decade. And you say, well, I don't want to go to one of these chains. What I'll do is I'll go to one of these independent boutiques that brings in these, specially crafted eyewear, with, names like Donna Karan or Tag Heuer. Well, if you go to almost any, pretty much if you go to any boutique in the United States now, you will be buying a good portion of the frames on the wall, of the brands before your eyes. Those are owned by this same company, Luxottica. They're a manufacturer. So pretty much this one industry in the United States is governed by this one Italian company. There's a few people around on the edges, but pricing, supply, it's governed by one company. Toothpaste. You go to the store, you see this huge array of options, all these different price points, all these different types of toothpaste. Well, pretty much almost all of the supply is the product of two companies, Colgate-Palmolive and Procter & Gamble. And this includes Tom's of Maine. And these companies, we had, I'm going to say something that didn't quite pass fact-checking for the magazine, but these two companies essentially collude in pricing and presenting the selection of toothpaste to you. There's this process that's called category management that most of the large retailers basically engage in, and they sort of force one company or another to kind of choose, basically manage the shelving for them. So like in some cases, maybe it's toothpaste. Procter & Gamble decides where on a shelf a product's going to go, how much shelf space it's going to get, what kind of pricing is going to be there. And a different one, it might be its competitor that handles, say, toothbrushes. But the result is basically a sharing of information and manipulation of the presentation of this product. Pet food. You go to the store and you see this bewildering array of operations, but if anyone paid any attention to the recall that happened a couple years ago, one of the things you might recall is that, in this country we have 6 companies that supposedly manufacture their own pet food and sell it out through retailers. And we have about 20 large retailers that put their own labels on the pet food. Well, 5 of the 6 branded companies and 17 of the 20 retailers that do private label were getting their pet food from one company, one plant, called Menu Foods. In fact, there were about 150 different brands that were coming off of this one line. Different prices, in many cases the exact same content. Milk. A little while back I was in a Walmart in Elizabethton, Tennessee, and I'd been talking to a dairy farmer, so I ended up going down to the milk section, looking at the options, the array of milk that we see there. And there were basically 4 brands. One of them was called Pet Dairy, one of them is called Mayfield, one of them is called Great Value, which is the in-house store brand for Walmart. They also had a little bit of milk from Horizon, which is a organic dairy, supposedly. Well, anyway, I did a little research afterwards, and I learned that Pet Dairy, the label, and Mayfield, they're both labels that are controlled by, owned by this company called Dean Foods. Dean Foods also provides in the Southeast all of the milk, or most of the milk, certainly all the milk in that store, that goes into the Great Value line. Dean Foods also owns Horizon. So basically, you got 4 different options and all these different price points. And I hope that the organic milk was a different pathway, but the milk in the other ones, it's all the same milk. Beer. We think this is one of the great successes in this country. Last 20 years, we've seen all this rise of all these different brands. In 1978, there were about 42 breweries in the United States. Now there's about 1,500. The difference is that in 1978, those 42, I think the largest share of the market was around 25%. Nowadays, we got 2 companies, Anheuser-Busch InBev and South African Breweries, which owns Miller Coors. They control about 80% of the market themselves, and if you look at all the interlocking relationships and their control over distribution, you're talking about above 90% of the beer in the United States. All those little craft brews, like 1,400 and maybe 95 independent companies, they get to share 5% of the marketplace. You know, we can go up and down the aisles, we can go up and down the malls in the same story. You know, we could find the same story to tell time and again. But, you know, just think about, look at this another way, which is look at the retailers themselves. Walmart, we all know Walmart's a big company, but do we have any idea how big a company Walmart is? You know, in some cases, they sell 20+% of the entire line of business of, you know, some various line of business in the United States. In some cases, you know, with soaps and detergents, it's upwards of 30%. With DVDs and certain lines of books, it's well above 40%. In some types of books, it's above 60%. In some, pet food, I believe, is above 50%. I mean, these were lines of business that were spread around, and all these hundreds and thousands of different companies in the United States a generation ago, 50% in some cases concentrated in the hands of one company. It's not just discount stores, it's also high-end stores. A generation ago, every town, every city in this country had independent department stores, and we had independent men's stores and women's stores buying clothing and furnishings for the local tastes. Now we have, after a generation of consolidation, one company, Macy's, controls upwards of 800 department stores. The ingredients in our food, thanks to Michael Pollan, you know, we do know that, and a few other folks, we do know that most of the food on those shelves, you know, a lot of them, it contains an amazing amount of corn, and we also know that of that corn, an amazing amount of the content is, you know, basically Monsanto product. But what about, say, the ascorbic acid that they use to preserve these products as they sit on our shelves? It's also known as vitamin C. Vitamin C is something that an American scientist first identified the structure of this. It was an American company that first figured out how to synthesize it. It was a different American company that first mass-produced it. Right now in the United States of America, about 100% of our vitamin C is controlled by a Chinese vitamin cartel. And, you know, basically, this is true of most of the chemicals that go into our foods and our drugs. Well above 80% of the content of our foods, of our drugs, comes out of China. It may say it's made in the USA, but that's only because they actually mixed the chemicals here. The materials inside the stores, the iron ore that goes into the steel and the beams, essentially two companies. Two of them are nominally separate, Rio Tinto and BHP, but they tried to merge. They essentially collude. The gravel under our tires as we drive through the parking lot, if you look at what the roll-up that's taken place over the rock pits in this country, we're paying a lot more for the gravel. I mean, this is true throughout system after system after system. Even the car system, the automotive system in this country, which you would think, here at least we have an example of real cowboy capitalism, or kind of a Japanese variant on cowboy capitalism, because you got 12 different companies maybe out there selling us different cars and hundreds of different brands. Well, beginning about 15 years ago, a lot of these big companies, these vertically integrated companies, began to outsource their operations. And after they started to outsource, when they took units that were inside their companies and they put them outside, monopolists came in and started to roll up control over these supplier operations. So the result is we see General Motors, here we see Ford, here we see Toyota, here we see Nissan. Underneath, increasingly, we see a communalized supply system. Rather than sort of me summing this up, actually, I'll turn to Jim Cramer of MSNBC. And this was something that he said on his show, Mad Money, about this is about 2.5 years ago, when the Justice Department approved Whirlpool's takeover of Maytag, which gave Whirlpool about a 75% control over the washers and dryers and stoves in this country. If there was ever any doubt in your mind that we have a government of, by, and for the corporations, if you thought for a second that we are not right back in the Gilded Age, if you had the least ounce of faith in our regulators to do the right thing, you should give that up right now. And then he went on and he said, on TV I play a guy who's just out to make you money, but when you're not trying to get rich, feel free to get mad. So how does this affect jobs? And, I had 2 jobs today, and one of them was to sort of lay out this, proof that we have seen this pretty radical concentration of power in this country. And the other is to look at how this concentration affects jobs. But before I get to that, just a couple of other points, because this concentration of power, Phil touched on the fact that this is of political importance, and it is. But let's just look at a couple of things. As pricing. That milk in that Walmart, when it's all coming from the same company, whatever price you see put on those bottles of milk, it's entirely arbitrary. There's no rivalry there. The Chinese vitamin cartel, just to give you here's a real-world instance of a price that we can actually track after they finally captured complete control over our supply of vitamin C. They jacked the price by 400%. As consumers, this kind of consolidation affects us, the variety of products that are put in front of us, the quality of those products. It affects the safety of the products. Innovation. New and better, that's an important thing. We want new and better products, more efficient systems, more efficient products. Well, if you have the power to tax, if you are a large company that has captured the power to manage, govern an entire system, it's a lot less risky just to avoid innovation. The American dream, owning your own business. Recent OECD study showed that the United States of America, this bastion of small business, that in terms of the percentage of the population that owns its own small business, we are now second to last. Out of 22 rich nations, we're second to last. We're below those socialists in Sweden. We are below France. We are below Japan. We are above only Luxembourg. Politics. This concentration of wealth and power we have seen over the last generation, it's not merely because the few control our financial system, our large banks. It's because these few also control our real world corporations. These are the levers they use. These are the tools that they use to direct, to gather the money that goes into their pockets, to control what we buy and how we buy it and the terms in which we buy it, and to govern the entire systems. And then last thing, which was touched on earlier, too big to fail. I'm not going to go into that, but that's how I actually got into this business of writing. That's why I ended up writing this book, is because my previous book was about too big to fail on the industrial system. I've been writing about too big to fail for 8 years. The reason I stopped writing about too big to fail, putting it on the cover of books, is because the elite in this country ain't going to fix it. They're going to, even though their children are at risk, I'll tell you, they ain't going to fix it. Jobs. Monopolization affects jobs in a whole bunch of ways. But, one of the ways, for instance, is bargaining power. Wonder why wages are stagnant in this country? Well, I'm going to give you one quick example. It comes from a white-collar job, shows what's happening to people who go and get Ivy League educations in this country today. if you go in the advertising industry, I got a lot of friends in the advertising industry. 10 years is not necessarily that new. I mean, the iPhone is a pretty cool thing. You're finally bringing everything together. But this has been going on for a long time. We should keep in mind that this month is the 10-year anniversary of the NASDAQ crash. So what do these old established companies do? Well, they govern their industries with the same iron hand that IBM was not allowed to apply to them because of the antitrust enforcement of those times. They take advantage of a freedom that IBM did not have, which is to crush their opposition or to buy them up. I mean, this is just a list of acquisitions by Google. It goes on for since 2001, it goes on for 3 pages. 62 acquisitions. Now, some of these companies, Google took them and made better things out of them. Some of them, Lord knows, these could be competitors with them. They could be, driving down prices. They could be creating new and better services and creating jobs in the process. But they all got gobbled up. And this is true pretty much in every one of our infotech and in pharmaceuticals. When you get a better idea, as soon as you have proven the viability of it, rather than growing this to scale nowadays, you just sell it out to one of the market governors. Last point I'm going to make, medical devices. This is a case in which, this is a story, that I tell in chapter, my 6th chapter. It's about this guy named Tom Shaw. Here's a guy who had a better idea. There's a lot of people in this country, nurses and doctors every year there's many, many, many thousands of needle stick injuries. That's where you're using a syringe or something, you accidentally stick yourself. About 6,000 people a year in this country end up with a really bad disease from that, hepatitis C, HIV. It's a big problem. This guy, Tom Shaw, some years back said, I could solve that, at least in terms of syringes. And he ended up inventing, he was an engineer, he thought about it, he invented this new type of syringe in which he stuck a spring inside of the tube. And what happens when you push the plunger all the way down, then it releases the spring, and the spring pulls the needle inside the tube, and then that needle is not there to stick anyone by accident, and it also means that this syringe cannot be reused, which is another vector for disease. Well, then Mr. Tom Shaw went out. He runs this company called Retractable Technologies in Little Elm, Texas, which is just north of Dallas. He went out to try and sell this, and you know what he found? He found out there is no market in this country for his device, hardly. Because there is a thing, these organizations called GPOs, Group Purchasing Organizations, which supposedly are supposed to represent the interest of hospitals buying devices from our medical suppliers, but they're actually the seat of the cartel that is run by the companies like Becton Dickinson and Johnson & Johnson, which make the devices. Becton & Dickinson runs about 90% of the syringes that are sold in this country. And they're the ones, they actually pay the GPOs to manage that system to their own benefit. So when he went out to sell this device, that was a superior device that would save lives. There just was no real market to sell it into. He's got a small market. He sells into some VA hospitals. He sells into some clinics. He sells into Haiti. He sells into Africa, but not in most of the hospitals in this country because that market is owned by his competitor. So, and this is a quote that is, I didn't get this. This came from when we were doing the article. And this is what Shaw told one of the editors at the Mariah Blakely at the Monthly. He said, I have spent, and this is a guy who, we should be relying on for the jobs of tomorrow. I have spent what should have been the most creative, productive years of my life sitting in depositions. By the time I'm done fighting, my patents will have expired. There's a guy, better idea, jobs of tomorrow, company of tomorrow, and he basically spends his time suing and being sued. So anyway, the markets of America are closed. And that means that the jobs of America are not being created, because the jobs of America are not created by government. They're not created by big government. By big business. They're created by real entrepreneurs. They're created by real scientists, real engineers, real executives, real bankers. These are the people who get together and figure out how to create new and better businesses, new and better ideas, new and better jobs. And they don't have the freedom to do so. So anyway, I'm going to turn it back over to Paul.
Well, thank you, Barry. Thank you, Phil. I'm going to ask a few questions that I think will be on the audience's mind. We'll get to some Q&A in a bit, but that I think will kind of frame this, the questions a little better. And my first question is, how did this happen? How did we get to a point where we had a fairly open market for most of our adult lives? And now we have this kind of industry by industry consolidation. Whatever happened to antitrust?
You want to do that? Yeah, I'll do that one. Jim. We had antitrust in this country for really since the 1773, which was the Tea Party. Tea Party was not, by the way, an anti-tax rebellion. It was an open commerce rebellion. It was the people who were importing the Dutch tea and were going to be locked out of this by this monopoly over tea that was being imposed by the East India Company. It was not an anti-tax rebellion. It was a anti-monopoly rebellion. Anyway, since then we've had anti-monopoly law in this country, and it actually goes back in the English tradition, 800 years at least, to the Magna Carta. After that 800-year history, however, about a generation ago, the Chicago school folks, when they came to power with Ronald Reagan, decided it was time to overthrow that. And rather than actually taking all of our anti-monopoly laws so carefully crafted and refined over the course of, for the modern economy, the modern industrial economy over the course of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they just said, well, we're going to change the frame that we use to interpret these laws. We'll leave the laws here, but until this point, the frame was competition for the sake of competition. The point of our anti-monopoly laws were to serve us as citizens by protecting us from concentration of political power and by protecting the marketplaces where individual proprietors, individual inventors could bring their ideas and properties to exchange freely with their fellow citizens. That's what the point of anti-monopoly law was. And then what these guys said is, we'll change it, and the new frame will be, we're going to use anti-monopoly law to serve us as consumers. So, the difference was, at this point, after 1981, any kind of merger, any kind of deal, any kind of size body that, like a Walmart, any kind of operation that could make a case that they're delivering a product even like a penny less than someone else, that deal gets approved. They don't have to actually keep that penny savings to you, over time. They don't have to prove that they're going to keep this delivering this savings to you next year and the year after. All I have to say is this year we're going to deliver this savings and this will help you as a consumer. So basically, it kind of turned anti-monopoly law on its head in 1981. Rather than being there to distribute power, ensure rivalry, ensure competition, they said, well, it exists only to promote efficiency unto monopoly. And now, a generation later, that's what we got.
All right. Well, so under the Reagan administration, you had a shift in the interpretation of antitrust legislation to say that efficiency and consumer welfare ought to be the basis of how we judge whether this merger or that merger should happen. For the next 20 years, you had play a little devil. We've gone through this exercise in the editing, but I'll do it for the benefit of you all here. For the next 20 years, we had quite an economy. We had a lot of new technologies, a lot of new jobs in the 80s and the 90s, a very yeasty and venturesome economy. And we also enjoyed lower prices for a variety of goods. Say what you want to about Walmart or Costco. They deliver lower prices than, say, A&P or Woolworths even did, much less a corner mom and pop store. So my first question is, aren't lower prices a value in and of themselves, and don't you need a certain amount of market concentration? Doesn't a certain amount of market concentration lead to more efficient ways of providing goods and services, and hence lower prices? And B, well, I'll get to the B part later. If you could just sort of focus on that, because I think the average person looks out and he says, yes, maybe there's been a certain amount of consolidation, but I'm personally benefiting in ways that I've seen over the course of my lifetime.
Go ahead.
Okay. Concentration absolutely is necessary in certain industries. Concentration, say chemical production. We wouldn't really want folks to be making chemicals in their backyard. Actually, Detroit has a lot of that going on right now, but that's called methamphetamine. So you do want to have, scale and scope in certain industries. Steel production and production of cars. You need to have. There is a real social value to concentration of capital, getting people under the same roof. And the thing is, from during the earlier eras of antitrust enforcement in this country, there was a recognition of the value especially for industrial corporations, that you need to have some real concentration. When it comes to retail, when it comes to trading companies, when it comes to services, in the old days, until the 1980s, there was a sense that there was no real provable benefit, economic benefit from concentration in retail. And there was a sense that there was a huge downside socially, that there was a real, that if people wanted to, that there was having distributed power over our economy as much as possible, giving people the opportunity to own their own businesses, to basically have property and the liberty to work it, that was a political right, fundamentally. So, but I would actually argue that the old system, in which you had distributed power within retailing, actually led to far greater real competition, hence far lower, you had lower prices, more variety. And one of the things is that when you have multiple retailers out there competing for your custom, they're going to go out and they're going to find different products. They're going to, work with companies to develop different products. So when that's one of the ways that you're going to be able to attract new people into your store. And then you also have, when you got multiple stores in the same place, you're going to have real price rivalry. The fact is, lower prices, that's what Walmart tells us, and they do deliver lower prices compared to Target even. And they certainly deliver lower prices than the independent convenience store. In fact, the convenience store, if they go shopping at Walmart, they can get prices often that are less than what they can get from the distributor. Distributors sometimes go to Walmart. And that's just because Walmart at this point basically has so much power that even compared to, say, like Target, they just on the basic basket of groceries, they have a 3 to 4% advantage they can just extract from the suppliers. So yeah, they are lower than the other systems. Are they as low as they can be? Certainly, if you're buying milk in Elizabethton, Tennessee, I'd say no. Certainly, when you look at the inputs in your pet food or the vitamin C, this concentration of power, which is largely much of the concentration power we see in the supply system is because of the way Walmart uses its power and the large retailers use their power. That concentration is giving the producers actually the ability now to raise their rents. As I mentioned with the beer, here we have a situation in which price of beer goes, the consumption of beer is down, input costs are down, the grain and energy that goes into beer, and yet they're raising the prices. Why? Because they got the power to do so. This idea that lower prices are, lower prices are a social benefit. Should they be goal number one? No. Liberty from concentrated power should be goal number one.
And having a job.
Should yeah.
Walmart's prices are not too useful if you don't have a job.
And actually, that's the other side. It's like so much is like lower prices. Like where, when you have concentrated power over the people who work in these jobs, these money, the lower prices, where is that savings coming from? It's coming out of the pockets of the people who work in these places.
Yeah.
All right. Well, then let me then ask the second part of my question, and that is, for 20 years after 1981, when the Reagan administration first began to shift its focus on antitrust, we had a pretty good economy. Why, all of a sudden, kind of at the turn of the last decade, did we go through this period of very low job growth? And how do you connect that to something that happened 20 years earlier?
Okay, I'll take a stab at that. There's a great economic historian at Harvard named Alfred Chandler who has written the best histories of American business economy. And near the end of his career, he made a discovery that missed him. He just missed it for a long time. He's right in like late 90s, right? And he came to realize that all this innovation that was going on in Silicon Valley and infotech generally had been largely the result of the anti-monopoly prosecution of IBM and other big tech companies in the 50s and 60s, where part of the settlement of those suits was that they had to share their technology, sometimes for free. And so, he actually puts it this way, that the Silicon Revolution was not really brought to you by Bill Gates. It was brought to you by some mid-level bureaucrat at the Justice Department who forced out all this different innovation. So there's always a balance. Every generation has to rethink this all the time. There's a balance between the economies of scale that can occur in production and distribution, and our economic freedom, our ability to be on our own men, our own proprietary things. This balancing question is never settled, if for no other reason than new technologies come along that force new issues, new questions. But I think what's most changed is that the need to even address that balance question is just not part of our politics anymore. You can go out with a BA degree in economics at any college in this country and not have the slightest clue that any of this is going on, or what the actual political economy works, how that works. You just got a head full of models that look at consumers as or Americans as profit maximizing or utility maximizing consumers. We need to have a new way of looking at ourselves, that we're not just consumers, we're also producers, or would like to be, right? And so I think that, to get to your question, what changed? First of all, there's kind of a tipping point effect, right? That the consolidation went on and on and on to the point that it drove down this small business formation and the job creation that goes with it. And also, it eventually, you can't run an economy on the great ideas locked up in IBM in 1955, right? And now there's a new model in what should be our big growth sectors called innovation through acquisition, where as recently as the 90s, we had a vibrant venture capital business that would fund new startups, and that's basically how Silicon Valley worked, starting in the 70s and through the 90s. But in the last decade or so, a new model has emerged, which is the big incumbent companies buy up any little company, right? Sometimes to good effect, but now that's in place, Silicon Valley is a kind of stagnant place compared to what it was in the 70s.
Well, let me again push back on this and try to kind of sharpen the reasoning here. So you've got a new model called innovation by acquisition, which, as Barry pointed out, Google is a great enthusiast for. I think a lot of what we think Google is probably most people's idea of an innovative near monopoly, right? They're every third day putting out a new technology that's going to change the world. Google Maps, Google Docs, and so forth. What I did not understand till I started editing this piece is that most of the technologies that Google's rolling out are technologies that they acquired by buying other companies. I mean, not that they don't do some innovation in-house, but the things that you think about, even the root parts of the root algorithm, right? That allows them to that is the base of their business model. They got that way. So, and they're kind of the Boy Scouts of Silicon Valley. So first do no evil is there. You have other companies that don't play quite by those nice rules. I'm thinking of Intel, which is sort of famous for crushing its competitors. But I guess my question would be, doesn't innovation by acquisition create a market for innovation, in the sense that if you're an entrepreneur, you're a professor at Caltech, and you're good at coming up with new technologies that can provide the basis of new companies. You're not a manager. You're not really an entrepreneur. You come up with the thing, and you're incentivized to do that because you know that Oracle or Microsoft is going to buy your product. Isn't that just as good a kind of a political economic conveyor belt of newness than the old system, which is you build your company till it grows big?
Sure. I mean, I guess we should probably first rename the model, because it's really not so much innovation through acquisition as acquisition of innovation, and Paul's actually onto this is a key debate, and it's an important debate, and there is this point at which bringing together products, bringing together elements, real value comes out of that. I mean, we have these solid state semiconductors. If you look at what used to be inside of a radio, and all these different pieces are now like something the size of a pinhead. So all these, and there were lots of different companies that provide the stuff inside the radio. So eventually, the fact that one company provides this thing that's a pinhead that does the same thing, there's real value there. So acquisition, standardization, these are not per se bad things. The issue is, how much acquisition one company basically is allowed to engage in, and whether anyone is really looking to see what the structure of this market might look like. And certainly from what we've seen over the last generation is that most of the systems that have been standardized by private actors for private purposes, and the public really hasn't had much say in any of this. And certainly when it comes to what parts of you could probably make a good case for Google buying a lot of these companies, but you could also probably make a good case that some of these companies should have been left alone to compete with Google. So, and there's no one who's doing that. There's no one who's looking at it. There's no form in which these. And what we do know is that in the old days there was you had acquisitions even at the best of times. When there was the most antitrust enforcement, there was acquisition and there was integration of companies, integration of technologies that was going on. And what we do know now is that there's been a real flip. There's very, very few companies nowadays which are being grown to scale. And Paul's right. Now, some of these guys, if you come, you develop your idea and you prove its viability and you sell out and you pocket $10 million or maybe $50 million, maybe $100 million, that's pretty good. And that person may be perfectly happy with what they've done, but this is also it's a public issue, it's a social issue, and we as a society, we may have benefited much more by having that person struggle to bring that company up to full scale. And right now, there's very few people who are doing that.
I'll just add a little evidence to that. If you think of the companies that are sort of the great 80s and 90s high-tech companies or kind of breakout companies, Apple, Oracle, in other industries, Southwest Airlines or FedEx, they're actually 1970s companies. They're companies that were founded in the 70s during the heyday, sort of the last great heyday of antitrust enforcement. And their IPOs were in the early 80s, sort of before the antitrust shift fully took place. And by the 90s, they had grown to be competitors of the incumbent airlines, competitors of the post office, competitors of IBM and RCA and Xerox. There have been Google and Amazon, and we're seeing even new big companies develop, Facebook, for instance. But
wait a minute, Amazon and Google are both
90s companies, right? Yeah, right. So it seems
so this decade we got Facebook.
Facebook,
Thanks.
right.
Like
so it seems like in fewer and fewer areas are you seeing, and this goes back to what Ted Turner wrote in our pages 6 years ago. For all the change in the broadcast industry in the last 20 years, there's not these sort of up by their bootstraps entrepreneurial guys that built giant competition. It's mostly dramas played out in the boardrooms of Viacom in New York, and so this pathway, it's not just your ability to start a new business, it's your ability to grow a new business and challenge the big boys that I think that we're actually talking about here. We've talked enough. We've got a lot of hands up, so. Our guy Dan Mandel here has the microphone, and if you'll wait for him before you answer and let us know your name and your affiliation, and keep it to a question, not a comment. Please, this lady here.
Hi, I'm Abigail Woodward, and I don't have an affiliation, but I wanted to ask about what if your product is something like education, and also what about things like Linux with its open source system, I think.
Two really good questions, and it's one we wrestled with in this. I think let me just take a little bit of a stab at this, because I don't think we've figured out the Uber theory of why jobs aren't being created. I think no one really knows that. I think we have a pretty interesting and plausible theory that the more I look at, the more I'm convinced is a component of it. But there are other competing theories, and one of the competing theories is that we have had this creation of a free technology, right? I don't think Barry's going to agree with me on this, but if you look at a lot of the technologies that have been put onto the market in recent years, like the open source companies based on open source technologies, or some of the social networking technologies, or things like Craigslist, they've destroyed a lot of value. They've destroyed a lot of business models, but they've not provided entrepreneurs or these companies with a whole lot of cash. Right? There's not a lot of jobs being created on these, at least not yet. And I think in the case of Linux, in the case of open source, really the expert on this is Phil. There are companies beginning to build business models around them. And I should really back off and let Phil talk about that, because I know he knows. Well, and what is the connection between Linux and education? I'm sorry? Okay. On education, again, we ran a piece some months ago called College for $99 a Month. And it was about an entrepreneur here in town by the name of Burke Smith, who has a company called Straighterline. And what he's done is, through a technology not unlike sort of the call centers or consumer response things that when you pick up the phone to call about a technology, you get somebody named Mary from the Philippines going to answer your questions. Well, he's done that with universities. So you have tutors in Poland or India who can tutor you on basic college 101, calculus or accounting or whatever, driving down the cost of that, and with online software and online teaching tools that are the same as used in any university, is able to deliver undergraduate entry-level courses for a fraction of what any of the other online firms are doing, or certainly the brick-and-mortar universities. We think this is the Craigslist of higher education. The downside is you're going to see if there's a lot of regulatory barriers to this actually happening, but I think it probably will over time. When it does, you're going to see a lot of jobs and revenue leak out of higher education. That's the downside. The upside is tuition is crushing the middle class, rising at actually higher rates than healthcare. And nothing has stopped it for 20, 25 years. And so you've got kids, working class kids, coming out of college with $50,000 in debt and presuming they have a degree. So something's got to erode that cost. So that's my response to that question. This lady right here.
Hi, my name is Dr. Caroline Poplin, and my question is about healthcare. The big idea of most of the policy elite in healthcare is something called the Accountable Healthcare Organization. Healthcare, at least for individual doctors, is one of the last decentralized businesses in the country. And accountable healthcare organizations, the model is actually managed care HMOs, like Kaiser. That's what all the policy people in the administration want. Do you think, does your model apply to that? Or how do you think about healthcare given how you've analyzed other industries? Thanks.
I'd say everything in healthcare is counterintuitive, upside down, right? Supply creates its own demand. It's just like, so you sort of have to check your ideology at the door. And while I wrote a book on advocating that the Veterans Administration was actually a good model. That's obviously quasi-monopolistic, right? I do think when it comes to healthcare, in many realms of healthcare, that there are advantages to scale in coordinating care, integrating care, having a single institution involved with the care of an individual over his or her lifetime. I think these are all places where we could actually, big is good, and I like Kaiser too. That said, we've got tremendous monopolization in medical device. It doesn't need to be there in drug manufacturing. Doesn't need to be there in health insurance markets. Doesn't need to be there. And this is an issue that the early Bush administration raised, and because they raised it, a lot of people just dismissed it. But I think it's a legitimate one. That the managed care revolution of the 90s started out as a very idealistic thing. A lot of people very idealistic about what HMOs could do, but it devolved into something that has resulted in, I believe it's about 70% all Americans now live in areas where there's essentially only 2 PPO networks, right? So, and we also see this very strong correlation where in a community where there's only a single hospital, right? They have such market power over the insurers and by extension over us that you see much higher prices. So that doesn't need to be there either. But as with any monopoly, right? Any natural monopoly, whether it's gas or whether it's HMOs, if you're going to let them have that concentrated market power, and because you want those economies of scale and the efficiencies that they can bring to it, you got to regulate them. It makes me wonder why you would even have profit involved in such an institution. That's my 2 cents.
At the very back,
Hi, Megan McCardle of The Atlantic and New America. In principle, this sounds to me like a sort of bog standard economic model that I was learning all the way back in the 90s about what happens in new industries where, in 1900 you have 200 car companies in Detroit, by 1955 you have 4, and by 1970 you've got 3, and that's pretty much it. Industries arise, there is a period of enormous entrepreneurship, and then there is acquisition. GM buys up 97 different companies, et cetera. And then eventually you settle on both a sort of standard technology form and a standard company form that basically consolidates to a few players in most key industries where there are barriers to entry. How is this different from that? And I guess as a corollary, one of the certainly things, of course I was at the Chicago school, so, but one of the things that I was learning is that if you in fact look back at the economic literature, the monopoly prosecutions don't seem to have actually had, the antitrust prosecutions don't seem to have had any effect. You can't see any of it in the market, it doesn't show up in prices, it doesn't show up in producer prices, it doesn't show up in anything. How is this different? Like how do you do this? Why is this different from all of those older examples?
Well, like with the cars, I mean, you're absolutely right. There was this kind of lockdown with cars down to 4 companies. I guess in the 1970s, American Motors was still independent. So into the 70s, we had 4 companies, and then we had 3, and then. But also at the time, we actually were using a different form of competition policy, which was called trade law, to allow in a bunch of other companies to compete with our big 3. So. One of the things we have to understand is that antitrust itself, there's competition policy properly understood is a much wider array. So we got competition in cars by allowing the Germans to play and the Japanese to play and now the Koreans to play. So no, but that was actually. But then we had but that's actually one of the things that drove decisions in the early 70s. VW started to come in big time in the 60s. The Japanese cars were all not allowed in the early 70s, or actually late 60s. So rather than going after the big guys, what we did is we let in a bunch of little guys. And that was a political decision. There's no such thing as free trade. It was a political decision to allow the Japanese car companies to come in. And part of it was to create competition. So it's just so that you have to look more holistically at the system. As to antitrust having no effect, I know that's an old Chicago school. It's a hoary old story that they tell. I mean, with as Phil was mentioning, like this case with Alfred Chandler. I mean, one of the things that was really interesting about antitrust enforcement after the war. I mean, there's sort of the classic American antitrust, to the extent we had it, to the extent we actually functioned for the public's purpose, was really dates to Second New Deal. The first New Deal, antitrust was suspended. First New Deal was the culmination of the whole progressive era in which it was basically this corporatist, socialist, who knows what it was, but it was competition was a major part of most parts of the progressive era. Beginning in 1935, when the Supreme Court said no, we're not having any more of this concentration, things went in a very different direction. They went initially through Congress. Congress took a very different. The populists in Congress went in a very different direction. Administration eventually caught up after 37. Then you saw them hire this guy named Thurman Arnold. Thurman Arnold was he was actually a progressive. He was somewhat of a socialist. But he was also a good New Dealer and did what he was told. And he put together this amazing team of people. And they said, well, if we're going to have competition, let's do it. And that's where they set up basically this model in which you had certain places you accept monopoly. You just regulate it. Certain places you have industrial oligopoly. But you make sure that you keep competition. And then you had this whole space where you keep, space free for the individual entrepreneur to move in and out, retail and farming, etc. In the industrial sector, one of the things that they did starting in 1944, and this is what Phil was talking about, is they would engage with these large companies, with IBM, with AT&T, with RCA, and they kind of threatened to break them up. And they back it down and they say, okay, here's the deal. What you're going to do is you're going to share out all these technologies, your source material, your secret sauce, you're going to give it out. Sorry. But in exchange for that, you get to, stay here. And it was kind of this, there's this Schumpeterian model which the Chicago schoolers really liked, because it's the idea that monopolies actually create innovation. That monopolists take their monopoly profits and invest it in new and better ideas. Well, if you actually look at what a monopolist like Intel does, it invests its money in two things: crushing its rival, AMD, and in advertising, buying lots and lots, hundreds of millions of dollars of advertising and say, we're innovative. But in reality, what they actually did back then is they said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to help you make this Schumpeterian model come true. So we're going to squeeze these profits out of you, and we're going to squeeze these technologies out of you, and we're going to give them to little people, so that those people in the Schumpeterian model who are supposed to be coming up with the little ideas that are going to chase the monopolists into the future, well, we better help them get going. And that's what we did for 40 years.
You want to, Megan, have a microphone there?
Sorry. There is like Bell Labs. I actually never heard that argument in Chicago, but it may have been made by different people. But I have actually heard it from a bunch of liberals who talk about the demise of Bell Labs as like the sad, the end of monopoly. But what I'm asking is, like, all of this behavior absolutely happens, but it happened in the 60s. It happened in the 40s. I guess what I'm asking is, why is it different now? What has changed? Why do you see... Like, I look around at markets, I absolutely see companies trying by any means possible to crush their competition far outside the ideal libertarian, like just making an awesomer product cheaper. But I see that in the 80s and the 70s and the 60s and the 50s and the 40s. Like, how has it changed such that, like, we can say things are really different? Because one argument would be just that, actually you were sort of saying it, is the companies of the 90s are the big companies of today, and some small company we've never heard of will be the big company next decade.
No, you're absolutely right. People will be people. That's why we actually create checks and balances and we separate out powers, because this is what people do. They try and fence other people into their systems. They try and kill other people, and then so the difference between the 1950s and 60s and now is there was some policing going on back then.
Walmart would have been illegal. I mean, to give you an example, many of us are old enough to remember the old AMP, or Atlantic and Pacific grocery stores. They were in litigation practically for the entire 20th century, right? They would, every time they try and grow a little bigger than they got, they get knocked down by state level and federal level things. Yeah. And then ironically, because they were forced to stay kind of small when the antitrust came off in the 80s, Walmart came in and killed them. By then it was too late, and it's the same story with Sears, right?
A lot of what we had, say, in the retail, those chains that we were dealing with when we were growing up, those were these legacy chains from the first, basically before the new dealers came in. And part of it is that there was like two ways to deal with this. You could either, try and like break things in little pieces, or you just kind of stop them where they are and you kind of let people grow around it. The French actually did this recently with Carrefour, which is this large, Walmart-like, Costco-like, they said, okay, we're not going to break this company up, but it's become too powerful, so we're essentially going to put a lid on its growth, and now we'll let, that way we're going to let other people come in and create the new ideas, the new companies. But Megan's point is people do not change. This is the way people act. So there was no change in what people are. It's just a change in policing, and it's a pretty significant change. Is whether we police this activity, whether we actually try and take the concepts of separation of powers, of balance of powers, and we take these ideas and apply them to our political economy as well as our political system. We used to do it. We don't do it now.
Some other questions. This gentleman right here.
Hi, I'm Michael Rose. I'm a reporter with BNA's Daily Labor Report. I think I read something in the invitation to this event that said something like, if the theory that you're putting forward is true, then government stimulus and tax cuts for businesses are not going to do anything to help spur job creation. So what will? What can we do right now to help jobs get started again?
Well, I wouldn't say that they'll do nothing, right? Only that they'll be woefully insufficient. But take your point. Gentlemen?
Well, I think we just have to get up every day and ask ourselves, what are the barriers to entrepreneurship in America? And the answer is going to be different in different realms. If we're talking in agriculture, we've got huge barriers to entry on all kinds of different levels. If you change it to a different system, then you have to ask yourself. We do know that whatever is responsible for the decline of entrepreneurship in America, it can't have much to do with too much burdensome regulation, because we've been cutting that back, right? So it's got to be elsewhere, and I think, you could, depending on what your perspective is, you would look at things like asset building programs to try and get people, with enough seed money when they're coming out of life, instead of being so indebted after college, that they can start to take some risks. I think passing a health care bill is probably be a gigantic boom to entrepreneurialism, because, for folks my age, the biggest obstacle to going out and starting your own company or following your dreams in some way other than a wage slave, can't get health insurance at an affordable price. That's a story of the whole generation now. You have anything you would add on that?
Yeah, I guess I think that, and I didn't write the invitation, but I think the government can play a role. Government stimulus, certainly can play a role in, protecting existing jobs and keeping a downward spiral from getting worse. And I certainly wouldn't ever make a case that there's no role for government. But in terms of creating the jobs of the future, I really don't want the government, anyone to. Just the idea that the government would be the place where we're going to think about what the jobs of the future should be, that I don't think is what we want. And what we want to do is empower individuals to do what they can, to work it out, to think it up, the new businesses, the new jobs. So. And actually, just one practical thing, and here's a case in which, I used to run my own business, or I used to work with a group of people, and we ran a magazine. It was an independent magazine, did it for 7 years. We lived out of the marketplace. We made our money off of advertising. We made our money off of subscriptions. We did not get any government money. But one of the things that, following that, cash flow from month to month. That was an amazing experience. And one of the things we used to do and this is where government might step in and maybe has failed recently. We used to live off of this thing called factoring. We'd get our receivables and we'd sell them to a bank someplace or some little trader, and they would give us money forward. And this allowed us to manage our cash a lot better because we didn't have a whole lot of it. We were a $5 million operation, which was not insignificant, but it's not a big deal. And so this was a major part of the way we survived. And recently, the biggest factoring company in the United States is called CIT. It's up there in New York. It's in the middle of the garment district. It helped keep all those little tiny companies in the garment district operating, kept their cash flow normal, or helped them keep their cash flow normal. When CIT, after the big banks were all just about going down, they said, "Oh, help us out. We're too big to fail." We threw all this money at them. When CIT said, "Well, we're about to fail, and when we go down, well, maybe we're not too big to fail, but if we fail, it's going to cause all this problem for these little people." Hundreds of thousands of companies use CIT to help. Obama administration said, "Sorry, go figure it out. We ain't helping you." So, having an actual strategy, having people in this, who actually understand, have a real strategic sense of what small business needs, that would actually be a real start. And the SBA, I'm sure there's a lot of good people there, but they certainly don't have a strategic sense of how to help out small business. I said the SBA.
Let's say too. One of the great changes of the last decade is basically the eclipse of community banking, small scale banking, and these are the guys that did the most financing of small business and of startups, and they worked on a relationship basis. So, starting in the '90s, we had this tremendous consolidation within banking. So the typical thing was the institution that used to be your local bank, was now some part of some giant bank in Charlotte or New York or San Francisco, and the guys in that bank just had a little formula for creditworthiness, that the headquarters sent them, and so you either met the criteria or you didn't for a loan. There was nothing like, well, I know your dad and I know you since you've been a kid and I believe in you, and that has been a huge obstacle. And again, in the monthly, we've done a lot of writing about ways to improve small scale finance. This is really true for farmers too. One of the great obstacles now to starting a farm. There's actual business opportunities out there, but the federal farm system is just so ossified and stilted that you can't get the kind of microfinancing that somebody might want or need to say start a small organic farm.
I would just add that this requires sort of looking at Washington in a different way. The way the town operates, we all sort of see it every day. You have incumbent industries that dominate the lobbying ecology. And, I wrote this accompanying essay this month about robber barons on K Street, we call it. The Mansur Olson, the great political scientist and theorist of lobbying, said that when you have markets with lots of independent players, sort of entrepreneurial markets, it's always going to be difficult for those individuals to collectively get their act together, come up with an agenda, and then press that agenda on politicians. It's just naturally difficult to do. When you have a market of a handful or one dominant player, they can more or less agree what their interests are, and they have the funds to pay the lobbyists to go do their bidding. And so we see that play out all the time, right? In this healthcare bill, the Democrats built their entire legislative strategy around trying to keep big pharma inside the tent, and they had to give away all kinds of stuff to keep them happy about it. Meanwhile, we had the cap and trade bill that went through the House, and the big coal companies got their benefits, and the utilities that use the coal got their benefits. Meanwhile, we have this revolution happening with natural gas. We're finding just giant reserves of it underneath the Appalachians in the West, But the natural gas industry is made up of mostly mom and pops, sort of fairly modest-sized producers, most of whom were Tea Partiers. They can't stand the government anyway, and they weren't at the table when the House was carving up the benefits and writing their cap and trade things. So even though natural gas produces half as much carbon as coal, they were not cut in. And simply because the lobbying for the natural gas industry is pretty inept. So they eventually partnered with the environmental groups and got cut into the Senate side of it. But you can see that the natural way things are going to operate in this town. And studies have been done looking to see if Mansur Olson was correct in a kind of systematic way. And sure enough, if you look at trade associations made up of a handful of big players are more politically active than trade associations made up of a whole lot of entrepreneurs. So you have to look at Washington and say, well, who is it going to provide our jobs? Who is going to provide our kids jobs? It's not the big incumbent players. They'll provide some jobs. It's some guy who's doesn't have a representative in Washington, and if he does, he's not very well paid and can't do his job very well because the industry can't agree with him. So it becomes the job of our leaders, right, to do a little leading and to craft policy based on what is going to be good for the people that can't represent themselves. Remember the guy, this poor twisted fellow that crashed his plane into the IRS office in Austin, right? I mean, he was a sad case and he killed innocent people. But David K. Johnson, the New York Times, did a story because David K. Johnson, no one understands tax law like David K. Johnson. He looked at what was this guy's beef. He read his suicide note. Turns out this is a guy who had spent his career trying to be an independent software consultant. Well, back in 1986, for a variety of reasons, Congress took away the ability of independent software consultants to be able to ply their trade as independent. They had to work for another company because there was fear that they would be cheating on their taxes or whatever. Well, that kind of crushed the business model of the independent guy that wants to sort of be out there on his own and earn his own living, live on what he kills. And over time, it became clear that model that tax provision made no sense. You had at one point 70 senators willing to get rid of it to allow a guy like this to go earn his own living. But there was really nobody ever pushing him to do it, right? Because people like this don't have lobbyists. And the guys who run the companies that hire these guys, right, and then sell off their labor, right? If you're a company that you've got 500 consultants working for you and you send them out to IBM and other companies, you take a cut of their pay, and, oh, by the way, you're not going to get to the choice assignments that build your skills and so forth. It's kind of a racket. Well, those guys had lobbyists here. So there's just nobody policing that. And I think if there's anything that we need in this country going forward for our economy is for us to recognize the value of the independent entrepreneur and what we need to do to make his or her life a little easier. There's a gentleman at...
Mind the clock there.
Oh, yeah. How much do we have have to wrap it up? Okay. How about we take 2 or 3 questions very quickly, keep it to 1 sentence, and we're going to try to answer them very quickly. This gentleman here.
What do you recommend about changes legislatively to competition policy, so IP, antitrust, anything like that?
Great question. Next one, right? The gentleman right next to him.
Is there a database that we can look at corporate concentration over sectors and across time?
Great question. Great question.